Hi there, and welcome back to another review video. Today we're talking about Back After This by Linda Holmes. If you're thinking about checking out Back After This yourself, you don't have to worry about spoilers in this video. The first half of my videos are always spoiler-free, so you can see if this book is your cup of tea. After a quick summary and a basic review, I'll give a clear spoiler warning before going into a deep dive on my thoughts and opinions when it comes to this book. Here's a quick content warning for Back After This. Back After This is about Cecily Foster, a podcast expert who spends most of her time working on other people's projects. She works at a production company and pitches a lot of her own ideas and would love to get to produce or host her own podcast. Her boss makes a deal with her. If she collaborates with an influencer and makes a podcast about a woman getting her shit together, her boss will finally let her produce a pilot for a podcast of her own making. Despite her reservations, Cecily jumps right into making this podcast with influencer Eliza, who insists Cecily will be able to find her true love through a rigorous and methodical approach. But like always, life has other plans. And it turns out the right guy for Cecily might not actually come from these careful, purposeful dates. Even though Cecily doesn't buy into all of Eliza's ideas, it does turn out that by the end of the podcast, she actually has somehow gotten her shit together. Before I give you my review for Back After This, let's do a quick run through of my rating system. 1 star means I could not finish the book. 2 stars means I struggled to finish, but I did. 3 stars means I enjoyed it. It was okay. 4 stars means I really liked it and I would recommend it to a friend. And 5 stars, which is my highest honor, means I would read the book again. Back After This gets a 4-star rating from me because I really liked it and I would recommend it to a friend, but I probably wouldn't read this one again. My favorite thing about this book by far was the comedy. It was laugh out loud funny to the point where I was often pausing so I could interrupt my partner and tell him about what funny thing had just happened or how the voice of the character had framed something to be particularly hilarious. I thought this book did a good job of towing the line between quirky and cheesy and downright cringy, and that really elevated the humor and made it fun and easy to read. If you read Back After This and you enjoyed it, these are some other titles you may enjoy. The Rom-Commers by Catherine Center. Back After This isn't exactly clean or sweet, as it does have some mentions of sexual intimacy, but it is definitely not a full open door romance, and if you're into that kind of level of spiciness, you may also like The Rom-Commers by Catherine Center. Catherine Center has a very similar kind of funny, quirky writing style and highlights a lot of the same humor and dialogue between characters. One thing I appreciated about Back After This is that it highlights a passion of the characters, which turns out to be podcasting. Forget Me Not is definitely more explicit when it comes to the intimacy levels, but it shares that same kind of theme of a character having a strong passion. In this case, it's weddings and floral arrangements. Expiration Dates by Rebecca Searle. In Expiration Dates, our main character receives little slips of paper that tell her exactly how long a relationship is meant to last. When you're reading Back After This, you get this kind of serial description of the different people Cecily goes on dates with, and Expiration Dates has a very similar theme where we get to see all the people our main character has been with in the past, as well as how long those relationships last. Both of these books do a great job of examining the process of dating and helping us to explore when we know if something's gonna work out or not, and how often we get those things wrong. Okay, we are now entering the spoiler-filled part of this video. If you like the sound of Back After This, click away now, go read it, and then come back so you can engage with my thoughts and opinions. If you like the sound of Back After This but you don't want to read it yourself, don't worry, I will give you a full rundown of everything that goes on in this book. Back After This opens with Cecily suffering through the production of a podcast that's hosted by a guy who just won't take her advice. He makes a lot of mouth noises and generally doesn't follow instructions for recording a good quality podcast, and we can see from this little interaction that it seems to represent a lot of Cecily's life at work, not being listened to and nobody taking her work as seriously as she does. Right after this, she's called into her boss's office where he talks about her hosting a podcast that's all about her getting her shit together, which seems to directly translate into building confidence and specifically finding a romantic partner. The production company isn't doing so well and it really needs a hit to be able to make up for some financial unsteadiness. Cecily really does not want to do this podcast and doesn't really buy into a lot of the stuff that's sold by the influencer who's tied to the idea, but she also really wants to start her own project and make a pilot for a podcast that she cares about. We learn that she came up with the idea for and helped to produce a now famous podcast with her ex-boyfriend who took the podcast with him when he left. So after making a deal with her boss in which she gets to create the pilot for her podcast and her best friend and her both have security in their jobs at the company moving forward, Cecily jumps into making the podcast with the influencer. Right away, there are things that make her uncomfortable. From the questionable sponsors for the show, such as food for single people, cat products, and a gym membership, to interactions with this influencer who has an all-white living living room and only drinks white wine inside to help protect those pieces. Cecily is on her way to work one day, walking out her front door when she sees a huge dog go bounding past with a leash trailing behind him. Immediately after that, a man comes racing by and he has a cape flapping behind him as he goes after the dog. As a naturally curious person, Cecily knows that she needs to follow up on this and figure out what's going on, and she ends up helping this guy get the dog by reaching into her purse, pulling out a jar of peanut butter, and tempting the dog to come over with the food. After they get Buddy the dog to come back over to them, we find out that he doesn't actually belong to our mystery man, whose name is Will. It turns out that cape actually came from a salon where Will was when he saw the dog get loose and run away and decided to jump up and chase after it. Will asks to exchange numbers with her, saying that he'd love to let her know and make sure that the dog got home safe. While they send a few texts back and forth, Cecily doesn't carry on a super long conversation with the dog chaser because she is so busy working on this podcast and meeting with Eliza the influencer. It's on her first test date for this podcast that she sees Will again, and it turns out he's the waiter at the fancy restaurant where her day is taking place. Cecily is having a really hard time paying attention to the man she's actually on a date with, as the chemistry between her and Will is pretty obvious at this point. After the episode airs, Will gives a quippy little statement that gets featured, and a lot of the listeners to the podcast immediately dub him Hot Waiter and start leaving comments about how Cecily should just go out with him. Eliza, the influencer, is super quick to dismiss this idea and writes a message to her followers saying that it's important to be intentional with your choices and not just chase after the first man who says something cute. And so Cecily continues going on a whole plethora of dates with guys who are really just perfectly fine. Meanwhile, the meet cutes or meet agains continue happening with Will. When Cecily goes in to get new headshots taken, it turns out the photographer is Will, and they spend a whole afternoon together talking and chatting while he takes photos of her. Cecily discovers that Will adopted the dog Buddy, and they get to know each other a little bit better. After her initial 20 dates that Eliza has set up for her, Cecily decides just to go ahead with one of them, Michael the doctor. The podcast seems to be going pretty well, and Cecily is invited to a party at Eliza's house to celebrate that fact. Cecily's pretty surprised when Will shows up at the party by invitation from Eliza, as he's the hot waiter from the first episode, so she thought it would be funny to bring him along. But Eliza also uses Will's presence at the party to find Cecily and remind her that even though they have chemistry, that doesn't mean he's the right choice for her. A few days later, Cecily is on a walk when it starts to pour down rain, and she ducks into a bank, and who happens to be there except Will, also there to try and stay dry. They end up chatting, and Will asks her to come over and dog sit Buddy while he's doing an engagement shoot. After her dog sitting adventure, Will comes home, and the two grow even closer, with Cecily sharing all the things that she enjoys about podcasting and even deciding to send Will a little test clip to see if he can figure out what's wrong with it. Will and Cecily are getting along great, but there's just one problem. Cecily still is going on dates with Michael the doctor for her podcast. Days later, it's pouring down rain and Cecily is relaxing at home when Will shows up at her door soaking wet and tells her that he figured out what's wrong with the audio clip. It's been edited so that all the breathing is taken out. This is the moment when the tension between the two finally snaps, and when Will comes inside, the two fall into each other. After this, they continue to see each other, with Cecily meeting Will's sister, and both of them talking about the individual things that brought them to DC. One morning, when Cecily is leaving his place, she happens to run into Eliza, who surprises her on the sidewalk and who also sees Cecily and Will kissing goodbye. Eliza is obviously pretty upset about this development given how hard she's been pushing back against Cecily going after Will, and Cecily tries to calm her down. While doing that, Cecily says some hurtful things about Will, downplaying their connection and giving examples of reasons why she doesn't even like him that much, which obviously upsets Will. He goes back inside his apartment, and things really start to go downhill for Cecily from this point. At work, layoffs continue to happen despite the success of the podcast, and Cecily finds out that through a company merger, she might just end up working closely with that ex again. At the crux of it all, this is when Cecily receives a forwarded email chain from Eliza, who has accidentally sent her correspondence showing that she and Cecily's boss and some other people involved in the project have been purposefully pulling strings and lying and talking about Cecily behind her back. Cecily goes to Will's place and apologizes to him, and then finally decides to take her life into her own hands and quits her job. As she's walking out of the building, Will comes to help her with it, and we have a little interaction with the ex ex that's pretty satisfying. At the end of all of this, Cecily decides she doesn't want to let the last podcast episode go up without the full truth of what happened. She gets her best friend and some of the other people involved in the project to come back into the production studio and edit everything so that the final episode tells more about what really happened. Our book gives us a happy ending with Cecily and Will together, and Cecily finally taking control of her own life and pursuing the projects that are important to her. Okay, so now that you have the full summary of the book, let's dive into some of my thoughts when it comes to my review and rating. When I first opened it back after this, I was coming off of a few DNFs, which weren't super great and were kind of threatening to put me into a reading slump. That's why I was so happy when I started getting into this book and realized that the voice and tone were pretty light, humorous, and overall made it a great, easy read. I really enjoyed Will's introduction and thought it was a meet cute that really walked the line between quirky and cringy really well. And I also enjoyed the subtle conflict between Cecily and Julie, which seemed to play out the way that a real conflict between best friends might. Back After This managed to surprise me in a lot of ways. When we were first introduced to Eliza the influencer, I was pretty sure we were gonna get handed a caricature of that kind of character. But I found that this book managed to balance a lot of her details really well, such as, okay, she has this clinical house where she only has white furniture and has rules about what she can and can't eat inside. And Eliza also has a very methodical approach when it comes to finding love, dismissing the idea of Will and focusing on how you should have a spreadsheet and be ranking people and eliminating people when it comes to your love life. But we also get to see the more human sides of Eliza, like how she really just wants to help people, how she can make real human mistakes, and how she's not just an empty shell of an influencer, but someone who truly believes in what they're doing and often has really good nuggets of advice to give to Cecily. This is less of a criticism and more just an observation, but I noticed that the parts of the book that I liked the least were when Cecily was interacting with her sister. Compared to her interactions with Will and Julie and Eliza, I felt that the scenes with the sister lacked a certain sparkle or chemistry, and I guess I kind of wish the sister had been developed just a little bit more. Because as it sits now, she was kind of a blank sounding board for Cecily anytime she needed advice. Before getting into this review, I gave you a couple of recommendations, and one of those was Forget Me Not by Julie Soto. There's a certain element to books that I really love, and that's kind of hard to describe, but basically it's when the book does a really good job of picking you up and setting you down inside of something you really don't have a lot of familiarity with. So this often manifests in like characters having these really strong passions and pursuits, and when the book is able to take those passions and integrate them into the story in a way that feels really interesting and lets you take a sneak peek into a world you've never seen before. Like I said, it's kind of hard for me to explain, but I'll give you a couple of examples. So one example for this with me was Carrie Soto Is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid, as it really just picks you up and drops you into the world of tennis and helps you to understand all of the intricacies of that world and gives you the view of passion for that sport through the main character. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is an example of this with video game design. We get a love song for Ricky Wilde and Flowers, Not Another Love Song, again by Julie Soto, and orchestra music. And there are a long string of food-related books that hit this sweet spot for me, like Sourdough by Robin Sloan and The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. Basically, I love reading a book where it's clear that either the reader or the character has a passion for something, and either the writer has a really, really good familiarity with that subject or has done a ton of research and is able to convincingly pass it off. And unfortunately, I just wanted this book to go a little bit further in that vein. We got a couple of scenes where we have the character talking about her love of audio and editing and her interest in that space, but I just wanted more. I wanted it to be more in depth and concrete and really just make me feel like I had been dropped into a world that I knew nothing about and then was able to become familiar with through the knowledge of that character. Honestly, I would have been okay with the book being a little bit longer if it meant that we got more texture and description when it came to those elements, but all in all, I really enjoyed Back After This, and I gave it a 4-star rating. It was a super easy read, and it actually made me laugh out loud a couple of times. I definitely recommend this book if you're looking for a quick, easy, lighthearted romance, and if you enjoy rom-coms and meet cutes, you'll definitely enjoy Back After This. If you are interested in any of the books I've mentioned in this video, please check out my affiliate links in the description. And as always, you can check me out over on Blue Sky or on Storygraph to keep up with what I'm reading now and what I plan to read next. Thanks for watching.